Hi, I'm Kimberlee Stafford, Chair of the Tonkintorp Real Estate and Land Use Practice Group. This is the second of a two-part series on lease work letters. In my last installment, I discussed situations where the landlord is doing the construction work. In this video, I will discuss work letters when the tenant is doing the work. To review, a work letter is the part of the lease that discusses the initial tenant improvements to be constructed before the tenant moves in. In some cases, the responsibility for constructing the tenant improvements falls on the landlord, most often in office leases. In other cases, the tenant is responsible for constructing the tenant improvements, most often in retail and in industrial settings, but also in some larger office leases. The main issues to look out for when the tenant is doing the work are, first, ensuring the tenant improvements to be constructed both satisfy the tenant's requirements for its business operations and are acceptable to the landlord through a robust planning and approval process. Second, establishing the tenant improvement allowance and disbursement conditions. Third, establishing the construction requirements. And lastly, protecting the landlord from liens. First, establish a clear plan approval process. Landlords will want to review the tenant's plans for construction that might affect the value, use, or function of their property, especially any construction that affects the roof, foundation, or structural elements of the building. The work letter should establish timelines for submitting plans for approval, and for the tenant, deadlines by which the landlord must approve or disapprove the plans, so that the tenant may submit the plans as part of its permit application. The tenant will also want to limit the basis for landlord's disapproval to things that adversely affect the value or use, or affect the roof or structural components of the building. Once the preliminary plans are approved, the tenant should not materially change the plans without the landlord's consent, or unless required by the permitting authority. Second, establish the tenant improvement allowance and when it will be paid. The tenant improvement allowance is usually set at a fixed amount per square foot of the premises, not to exceed the actual cost of construction. It either gets paid upon completion of construction or in installments during construction, subject to a retainage that is paid upon completion. If it is paid upon completion of the construction, the landlord usually agrees to pay it only upon receipt of the tenant's architect's certification that the construction has been completed in accordance with the plans, receipt of the final certificate of occupancy, and lien waivers from the contractors and material providers. If the tenant improvement allowance is paid in installments, each installment is subject to the landlord's receipt of a draw request, copies of invoices for the work, the architect's certification that the work encompassing the draw has been completed, and partial lien waivers. Then the final payment is subject to all the same items as the single payment described previously. Third, establish the construction requirements. Typically, the landlord is going to want the following to be included. One, that the tenant obtain and deliver copies to the landlord of all required permits before the work begins, and that the tenant also delivers a copy of the certificate of occupancy upon completion. Second, to provide for the landlord's prior approval of the contractor, often including requiring the tenant to use the landlord's preferred contractor for anything that will affect the roof or structural components of the building. Third, require tenant to perform the work in accordance with the approved plans and in accordance with all laws. Fourth, often the landlord will require a certificate from the tenant's architect that all work has been completed. And lastly, provide for the tenant's contractor to maintain certain insurance, including liability coverage, builder's risk, and workers' compensation coverage. Lastly, you'll want to ensure that the landlord in the property is protected from liens. Landlords will want the tenant to covenant that it will not allow any liens to be filed with respect to the property, and they'll want advance notice before construction begins so that the landlord may post notices of non-responsibility. The landlord may also require that the tenant provide a payment bond for the construction, although tenants will resist this because bonds can be expensive. And finally, the landlord will require that the tenant bond over any lien that actually it does get filed, or the landlord has the right to pay the disputed amount and seek reimbursement with default interest. This has been a brief overview of things to think about for lease work letters when the tenant is doing the work. If you haven't already, please check out my previous installment on work letters when the landlord is doing the work.